Welcome to Endurance Sweat, where it's all about training hard and having fun. In this video, I'll be talking about Zwift's stress points. This is the second video in a four-part series about Zwift's fitness tracking. Zwift uses stress points to measure the physiological stress of a ride, and it's a function of the ride's intensity and duration. Now, to calculate stress points, we're first going to have to determine the weighted average power of a ride, the ride's intensity ratio, your FTP, and the duration of the ride. I've used several terms here. For example, weighted average power. You may know it as net power, and I've used intensity ratio. You may know it as intensity factor. And Zwift's stress points is also known as training stress score. These measures were developed by Dr. Andy Coggan around 2003 and popularized in the book Training and Racing with a Power Meter, authored by Hunter Allen and Dr. Andy Coggan around 2006-2007 and published by VeloPress. They are often associated with Training Peaks, and the terms are copyrighted by Peakswear LLC. Now let's talk about the development of that measure, weighted average power. You would be familiar with average power. For example, if we rode at 2, 3, 5, 4, and 1 relative power levels, the average for those 5 periods would just be the sum divided by 5, equaling 3. But we all know that the stress that your body has to absorb increases as the power level increases. And if you look at the lactate power curve, we can see that it rises as the power level goes up. So we ought to weight the power level in line with the increasing stress that our body has to absorb. And in the weighted average power measurement that Dr. Andy Coggan developed, which he called net power, he raised the average power of each segment to the 4th power, added those up, divided them by the number of segments, and then took the 4th root of that average. So in the example that I'm putting up here, 2 to the 4th power, 3 to the 4th power, and so on, add it all up, divided by 5, and then take the root of the 4th power. And now you can see that rather than an average power of 3, we get a weighted average power of 3.75. Now I got to wondering, why raise these individual average power levels to the 4th power and then take the 4th root? What could explain that? So I plotted curves for y equals x, x squared, x to the 3rd power, and x to the 4th power. And lo and behold, it seems that the curve for x to the 4th power looks an awful lot like the lactate power curve. So I surmise the reason for using the 4th power is because it looks very similar to the lactate power curve. Just to clarify, I haven't seen anything to substantiate this, but it still makes an awful lot of sense to me. Now, let's go back to that chart that I used to demonstrate the difference between average power and weighted average power. In that case, the average power was 3 and the weighted average power was 3.75. Now, I'm going to point out the obvious. The average power and the weighted average power will be the same if you rode at the same level for the whole period. Now, why point that out? Well, it might help us internalize what weighted average power means. So if you're riding at different levels and you get a weighted average power of, like the example that I used, 3.75, that would mean to get that same physiological load, you'd have to ride at that same level, 3.75, for the whole period. Okay, let's move on. Now, how do you go about calculating the weighted average power for a full ride? Well, you start by breaking down that full ride into 30-second segments. And then you calculate the simple average power for each of those 30-second segments. And then you raise each of those to the 4th power, add them all up, and divide by the number of segments. And then you take the 4th root of that result. So the same calculation that I showed you earlier, but now including a full ride. And that's how you get weighted average power or net power. I hope that explanation has been clear enough. If not, leave a comment to the video and I'll do my best to clarify. Now I've explained the first one of these measures that we need to ultimately calculate stress points. Now let's go on to intensity ratio. It's a lot simpler. Intensity ratio, or intensity factor, is equal to the weighted average power of a ride divided by your FTP. It's just that straightforward. How intense is the ride compared to your functional threshold power? Intensity ratio. So now we've figured out how to get weighted average power and the intensity ratio, and you ought to know your FTP and will know the duration of the ride. So now we're all set to figure out how we calculate stress points. So let's look exactly how we calculate stress points. And remember, stress points is a measure of the physiological stress of a ride. It's equal to the weighted average power of the ride times the intensity ratio of that ride, and then divided by your FTP, multiplied by the duration in seconds, divided by 3,600, and then multiplied by 100. And remember, the 3,600 is the number of seconds in an hour. And that will give you the result of Zwift's stress points, otherwise known as TSS, Training Stress Score. First, let's take note that a 1 hour ride at your FTP for the full hour would give you 100 stress points. Take that as a point of reference. Now let's look at a couple of examples. In the first example, the weighted average power is 196 watts. The intensity ratio is 0.83. The duration is 1 hour. And the FTP for the rider we're looking at is 236 watts. So applying these numbers to the formula, the stress points would equal 69. Now let's look at a second example. In this case, the weighted average power is 160 watts, so lower. The intensity ratio is 0.68. The duration is longer, 1.5 hours. And the FTP, again, is 236 watts. And if we apply these numbers to the formula, we get stress points equal 69. So if you notice, we did a 1 hour ride at 196 watts and a 1.5 hour ride at 160 watts, and we came out with the same stress points. So that's something to take notice of. You can do a shorter, more intense ride or a longer, less intense ride and get the same number of stress points. Now, where do you find out your stress points when you're riding on Zwift? If you've set up your heads-up display to display your stress points, or SP, you can see it displayed in the top left-hand corner. So far, I've got 22 SP for this ride. And now it's flipped to 23. So where else am I going to be able to see my stress points? Now that I've finished my ride, and I'll end the ride, and then if I click on timeline, it will show me my stress points for the ride in the top right-hand corner. And the same if I click on critical power, it will continue to show me my SP. And then click on OK. And after you've saved your ride, in your progress report, under fitness trends, if you set stress points as your goal, it will show you your SP under your progress bar. So after the ride, there are several places that you can look to see how many stress points you've earned. Now, oddly enough, stress points are not reported on any of the activity reports, either on the companion app, on any of the screens, or on the activity report that you will find on the Zwift webpage. On any of those screens. But as I showed you in the previous video of this series, you can see your daily stress points for the week on the companion app. They'll show up on the home screen if you've chosen stress points as your weekly goal. But even if you've chosen another weekly goal, like distance, as I'm showing here, you can always change that to stress points. And then examine your stress points for each day of the week right here. Just as an aside here, if you're riding outside without a power meter, how might you estimate your stress points? Well, here are some guidelines. Stress points for an hour ride. Now just take note, this is an hour ride at each one of these discrete levels. So if you ride for an hour at about 60 to 75% of your FTP, a rating of perceived exertion of between 3 and 4, well, that 1 hour ride at that level would be between 36 and 56 stress points. But let's say you rode at your threshold level, between 90 and 104% of your FTP. That would be at a rating of perceived exertion between 7 and 8. Well, for that ride, be between 81 and 108 stress points. And that's in accord to what we said earlier. Riding at FTP for an hour is 100 stress points. We know you're not going to ride for a full hour exclusively at one of these levels. So let's look at an example of a short interval workout. The full workout is only 27 minutes, and it includes 5 times for 1 minute at the recovery level. So 5 divided by 60 minutes divided by 36 stress points per hour for recovery gives you 3 stress points. And then 2 times 5 minutes at the tempo level, and we do that calculation, gives us 12 stress points. And then 6 times for 2 minutes at VO2 max gives us 20 stress points. So for that whole 27-minute ride, we get 35 stress points. So let's summarize. Stress points, or training stress score. It measures the physiological stress of a ride, and it factors in both the intensity and duration of the ride. We need to know the weighted average power, or net power, and the intensity ratio, otherwise known as intensity factor. And now that we know how to calculate stress points, well, we can go on in the next video and I'll explain in some detail how we get your training score and status. So I'll hope you come back to Endurance Sweat to watch that video. I hope you found this video interesting. It really gets into the technical weeds. But if you have found it helpful, why, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to Endurance Sweat, and click on that notification bell so you can watch the third part in this 4-part series of Zwift's fitness tracking. Okay, until next time, train hard and have fun.